At 11:52 p.m. Brussels time tonight, the European Union invoked Article 42.7 of the Lisbon Treaty, the EU's mutual defense clause that has only been used once in history, after the 2015 Paris terrorist attacks. But this time, the EU is not invoking collective defense against terrorism or military attack. The EU is invoking collective defense against the United States, specifically against what the European Commission is calling systematic economic coercion designed to destabilize European economies and undermine European sovereignty. Within 90 minutes of the invocation, 24 of 27 EU member states voted to approve a coordinated economic response package worth $280 billion. This is the largest economic counteroffensive ever organized by America's closest allies, and Washington had zero warning it was coming. Subscribe immediately, because what you're about to witness is not just a trade dispute, it's the formal activation of a mutual defense treaty by Europe's largest economies, treating American policy as equivalent to military aggression, and the response they've authorized has the potential to trigger the deepest transatlantic crisis since World War II and fundamentally redefine what collective defense means in the 21st century. Let me explain what Article 42.7 actually is, because this is not widely understood outside EU defense policy circles, and the details matter enormously for understanding why what just happened is so shocking. Article 42.7 of the Lisbon Treaty is the European Union's mutual defense clause. It was created in 2009 as part of the treaty that governs how the EU operates, and it states, quote, "If a member state is the victim of armed aggression on its territory, the other member states shall have towards it an obligation of aid and assistance by all the means in their power," end quote. This clause was designed as Europe's answer to NATO Article 5, the provision that says an attack on one NATO member is an attack on all. The EU wanted its own version that would allow European countries to respond collectively to threats, even if NATO or the United States chose not to act. The key phrase in Article 42.7 is armed aggression. That language was deliberate. It was meant to limit the clause to military attacks or terrorism, situations where a member state faces physical violence on its territory. Article 42.7 has only been invoked once, on November 13, 2015, the day after ISIS carried out coordinated terrorist attacks across Paris, killing 130 people. France invoked Article 42.7, and EU member states responded by providing military support, intelligence sharing, and assistance with counter-terrorism operations. That invocation was uncontroversial because everyone agreed that terrorism qualified as armed aggression. But tonight, the EU is arguing something completely different. The European Commission is arguing that armed aggression should be interpreted to include economic aggression that threatens the territorial integrity, sovereignty, and security of member states. This is a massive expansion of what Article 42.7 means. The EU is saying if a country uses economic weapons, tariffs, sanctions, threats to withdraw security cooperation to try to coerce us into changing our policies or to destabilize our economies, that constitutes an attack under the Mutual Defense Treaty, and we can respond collectively. And the country they're responding to is the United States of America. At 9:47 p.m. Brussels time, 3 hours before the formal invocation, the European Commission released a 47-page legal memorandum arguing that President Trump's actions over the past 3 weeks meet the threshold for economic coercion that qualifies under Article 42.7. The memo is structured like a legal brief, and it methodically builds the case that what the United States is doing constitutes aggression. The memo cites 4 categories of evidence. First, Trump's threatened tariffs. On February 18th, President Trump threatened to impose 25% tariffs on all goods imported from the European Union unless the EU, quote, stops discriminating against American companies and starts paying its fair share for defense, end quote. The EU memo argues that these tariffs, if implemented, would cost European economies $120 billion per year in lost exports and would trigger recession in multiple member states. The memo characterizes this as, quote, the use of market access as a weapon to coerce policy changes, end quote. Second, U.S. threats to intelligence sharing. Trump has publicly stated that the United States is, quote, reviewing all intelligence sharing agreements with countries that don't treat us fairly, end quote. The EU memo argues that withdrawing intelligence cooperation on terrorism, cyber threats, and foreign espionage makes European citizens less safe and constitutes a deliberate effort to increase European vulnerability for political leverage. Third, threats to withdraw U.S. military presence. Trump has threatened to pull U.S. troops out of Germany and has suggested that NATO members who don't meet spending targets don't deserve American protection. The EU memo argues that after 75 years of U.S. troop presence in Europe, sudden withdrawal would create security vacuums that adversaries could exploit, and that threatening withdrawal to coerce policy changes is, quote, using security guarantees as blackmail, end quote. Fourth, public questioning of European sovereignty. The memo includes a section cataloging Trump's statements questioning whether the European Union should exist, whether Germany should be independent or, quote, part of a larger Eastern European federation, end quote, and whether France's government is, quote, legitimate given all the protests, end quote. The memo argues that these statements from the President of the United States undermine the territorial integrity and sovereignty of EU member states. The legal conclusion of the memo is that these four categories of actions taken together constitute systematic economic coercion designed to destabilize European economies, undermine European decision-making sovereignty, and create security vulnerabilities that threaten the safety of European citizens. The memo argues, quote, this meets the threshold of aggression under Article 42.7. The fact that the aggression is economic rather than military does not diminish its severity or its threat to member state security. At 10:32 p.m. Brussels time, the European Commission President convened an emergency session of EU heads of state via secure video conference. All 27 member states were represented. The session lasted 1 hour and 8 minutes, and according to sources who were briefed on the meeting, the tone was somber and determined. The Commission President opened by presenting the legal memo and asking a direct question. Do member states agree that the United States' actions constitute aggression that warrants invoking Article 42.7? According to sources, France's President Macron spoke first. Macron said, quote, for years I have warned that Europe cannot depend on the United States for our security. I was told I was being alarmist. Now we see that I was correct. The United States under this president views Europe not as an ally, but as a competitor to be weakened. That is aggression, and we must respond, end quote. Germany's Chancellor Scholz spoke next. Germany has traditionally been the most cautious EU member, always seeking to avoid confrontation and maintain transatlantic unity. But according to sources, Scholz said, quote, Germany has tried every diplomatic channel to resolve this crisis. We have been met with threats and insults. Our economy is facing existential threat. Our security is being questioned. If this is not aggression, I don't know what is. Germany supports invoking Article 42.7, end quote. That statement from Germany was the turning point. If Germany, the EU's largest economy and most Atlanticist member, was prepared to invoke collective defense against the United States, then other members felt they had political cover to do the same. Italy's Prime Minister spoke in support. Spain's Prime Minister spoke in support. Poland's Prime Minister said, quote, Poland depends on American security guarantees to deter Russia, but we also recognize that if America can threaten Canada and Europe today, they can threaten Poland tomorrow. We support collective European response, end quote. The Netherlands, Belgium, Austria, Sweden, Finland, Denmark all indicated support. Even Ireland, which maintains military neutrality and rarely participates in EU defense matters, said it would support invocation. Only 3 countries expressed reservations. Hungary's Prime Minister, Viktor Orbán, said Hungary would abstain from the vote, calling the invocation, quote, an overreaction that risks destroying the transatlantic alliance, end quote. Slovakia and Cyprus also indicated they would abstain. But 24 of 27 members were prepared to vote yes. At 11:41 p.m., the Commission President called for a formal vote. The question was, should the European Union invoke Article 42.7 of the Lisbon Treaty in response to systematic economic coercion by the United States? The vote was conducted by secure electronic ballot. The results were final at 11:52 p.m. 24 yes votes, 3 abstentions, 0 no votes. Article 42.7 was invoked. At 11:58 p.m., the European Commission released a public statement. The statement was brief and carefully worded. It read, quote, "Tonight the European Union has invoked Article 42.7 of the Lisbon Treaty. This mutual defense clause obligates EU member states to provide aid and assistance to any member facing aggression. The European Union has determined that systematic economic coercion by the United States, including threats of devastating tariffs, withdrawal of intelligence cooperation, threats to remove military protection, and public questioning of European sovereignty, constitutes aggression that threatens the security and territorial integrity of EU member states. Accordingly, the European Union is activating a coordinated response to defend European economies, European sovereignty, and European citizens. Details of this response will be announced within 24 hours. The European Union remains committed to transatlantic partnership, but that partnership must be based on mutual respect, not on coercion." End quote. Subscribe right now because what I'm about to show you is the evidence that the economic response package Europe just approved is not symbolic. It's a $280 billion counteroffensive specifically designed to inflict maximum political and economic pain on the United States, and the targets were chosen with surgical precision. At 12:17 a.m. Brussels time, 6:25 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, the U.S. ambassador to the European Union received an emergency phone call from the Commission President. According to sources, the Commission President informed the ambassador that Article 42.7 had been invoked and that the EU would be implementing an economic response package. The ambassador asked what the package included. The Commission President said, quote, "You'll find out when we announce it publicly. Your government gave us no warning before threatening our economies. We're extending the same courtesy." End quote. The call lasted 3 minutes. At 12:34 a.m., the U.S. ambassador called the Secretary of State. According to sources, the ambassador said, quote, "They invoked 42.7 against us. This is real." End quote. At 1:02 a.m., an emergency National Security Council meeting was convened at the White House. Attending were the National Security Advisor, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of Treasury, the Director of National Intelligence, and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. According to sources, the meeting opened with the National Security Advisor briefing the group on what had just happened in Brussels. The question on the table was simple: what does this mean, and how do we respond? The Secretary of State's position, according to sources, was that the EU invoking a mutual defense treaty against the United States is a diplomatic catastrophe of historic proportions. It signals to the entire world that America's closest allies view U.S. policy as equivalent to military aggression. That perception will embolden adversaries and will encourage other countries to build security arrangements that exclude the United States. The State Department's recommendation was immediate de-escalation, withdraw all tariff threats, issue a statement reaffirming commitment to the transatlantic alliance, and request emergency consultations with EU leadership.
The Pentagon's position was similar. The Secretary of Defense argued that if Europe begins redirecting defense spending away from U.S. weapons systems toward European alternatives, the U.S. defense industrial base loses $60 billion per year in export revenue. That revenue supports hundreds of thousands of American jobs and funds research and development that keeps U.S. military technology ahead of competitors. The Pentagon cannot afford to lose the European market. The Treasury Secretary's position was the most alarming. According to sources, the Treasury Secretary told the group that if the EU implements major retaliatory tariffs on U.S. goods, American GDP growth projections drop from 2.1% to 0.3%. That's not technically a recession, but it's close enough that consumer confidence collapses. If the EU goes further and begins freezing U.S. corporate assets or restricting financial transactions, the risk of actual recession becomes very high. The Treasury Department's recommendation was avoid escalation at all costs. But then, the Director of National Intelligence provided an assessment that changed the tone of the meeting. According to sources, the DNI said that U.S. intelligence agencies had intercepted communications suggesting that China has been in contact with EU officials, offering to help finance European infrastructure projects and to provide alternative export markets if EU-US trade collapses. The intelligence suggests China views the current crisis as an opportunity to drive a permanent wedge between the United States and Europe. If that happens, and Europe reorients economically toward China, the geopolitical balance of power shifts fundamentally against the United States.
At 1:45 a.m., President Trump was woken up and briefed on the situation. According to sources, Trump was told that the European Union invoked a mutual defense treaty against the United States and that 24 countries voted yes. Trump reportedly asked, "What does that even mean? A defense treaty against us? We're not attacking them," end quote. Advisors explained that the EU is arguing that economic coercion is a form of aggression. Trump reportedly responded, "So they're saying tariffs are the same as war? That's insane," end quote. Advisors then explained that the EU is preparing a major economic retaliation package and that U.S. companies and farmers will be hit hard. Trump reportedly said, "Let them. We'll hit them harder. They need us more than we need them," end quote. The National Security Advisor tried to explain that the EU is America's largest trading partner and that a trade war with Europe would hurt the U.S. economy significantly. Trump was reportedly dismissive. He said, quote, "I've been hearing that my whole life. Everyone says we can't do this, we can't do that because it'll hurt the economy. I did the tariffs on China. Everyone said it would be a disaster. We were fine. Same thing here," end quote. At 2:23 a.m., advisors gave up trying to convince Trump to de-escalate. At 2:51 a.m., Trump posted on social media, quote, "The European Union just declared economic war on the United States. They invoked some treaty claiming we're attacking them. We're not attacking anyone. We're just demanding fair trade. But if they want war, they'll get war. I'm announcing massive tariffs on all EU goods effective immediately. They will regret this," end quote. At 3:15 a.m., U.S. stock market futures opened for overnight trading. Within minutes, Dow futures dropped 847 points, S&P futures dropped 93 points, NASDAQ futures dropped 212 points. The drops were driven by panic that a U.S.-EU trade war was about to spiral out of control. At 3:40 a.m., the Treasury Secretary called President Trump. According to sources, the Treasury Secretary said, quote, "Mr. President, the markets are crashing. If you go through with immediate tariffs, we're looking at a potential recession," end quote. Trump reportedly responded, quote, "The markets always overreact. They'll be fine," end quote. The Treasury Secretary said, quote, "Sir, with respect, this is different. The EU just activated a mutual defense treaty. If we escalate, this becomes an existential crisis for the transatlantic alliance," end quote. Trump reportedly said, quote, "Good. Maybe it's time for a new alliance, one where we're not getting ripped off," end quote. At 4:08 a.m., the Pentagon released a statement. The statement was released without White House approval, and it directly contradicted the president's social media post. The Pentagon statement read, quote, "The Department of Defense values our partnerships with European allies. We have fought alongside European nations in every major conflict for over a century. We believe economic disputes should be resolved through dialogue, not through escalation. We urge all parties to engage constructively and to remember that the strength of the transatlantic alliance has been the foundation of Western security for 75 years, end quote. That's the Pentagon publicly breaking with the president for the third time in 2 weeks. U.S. military leadership is sending a clear signal to European allies that the uniformed military does not support the president's approach, and that if this crisis can be managed until Trump leaves office, the U.S. military will work to repair the damage. At 5:32 a.m., Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer released a statement, quote, "The president is managing to do what Vladimir Putin couldn't accomplish in decades, fracture the Western alliance and turn our closest allies against us. The European Union just invoked a mutual defense treaty against the United States. Think about that. Our allies are using a treaty designed to protect against military attacks, to protect themselves from American policy. This is a national security catastrophe, and it's entirely the result of this president's reckless, threatening behavior," end quote. At 6:15 a.m., the 12 Republican senators who have consistently broken with Trump on foreign policy released a joint statement. The statement read, quote, "We warned the president that threatening our allies would have consequences. Now the European Union has invoked collective defense against the United States. This is humiliating and dangerous. We call on the president to immediately withdraw all tariff threats, to reaffirm America's commitment to our European partners, and to request emergency diplomatic consultations. If the president refuses, Congress must consider whether legislative action is necessary to prevent further damage to America's alliances," end quote. But at 7:03 a.m., Senator Tom Cotton, a Trump loyalist, released a counter-statement, quote, "If our so-called European allies want to declare economic war on the United States, let them try. They'll come crawling back when they realize their economies can't survive without access to American markets and American protection. The president is right to stand firm," end quote. At 8:37 a.m. Brussels time, 2:37 a.m. Eastern, the European Commission held a press conference to announce the details of the economic response package. The press conference was carried live by every major news network in Europe and was streamed globally. The Commission president spoke for 11 minutes and did not take questions. She began by saying, quote, "The European Union did not seek this confrontation. For weeks we attempted diplomatic engagement. We were met with threats. We attempted to address concerns through negotiation. We were met with ultimatums. We made clear that economic coercion would not be tolerated. We were ignored. Last night, 24 European nations invoked Article 42.7 because we determined that the United States is engaging in systematic economic aggression designed to weaken European economies and undermine European sovereignty. Today, we are announcing the collective response that EU member states have agreed to implement," end quote. She then outlined the 4 components of the $280 billion response package. Component 1, retaliatory tariffs totaling $120 billion. The EU will impose tariffs on specific categories of U.S. goods chosen to maximize political impact in the United States. The targeted products include bourbon whiskey, which is produced primarily in Kentucky, the home state of Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell, Harley-Davidson motorcycles produced in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, both swing states, Levi's jeans produced in facilities across the American South, agricultural products including soybeans, corn, and pork, which will devastate farmers in Iowa, Nebraska, and other Midwest states that voted for Trump. The tariffs range from 35% to 50% and are designed to make U.S. products uncompetitive in the European market. The EU estimates these tariffs will cost American producers $120 billion in lost revenue over the next 2 years.
Component 2, frozen corporate assets totaling $80 billion. The EU will freeze certain financial transactions and assets belonging to U.S. corporations operating in European territory. This includes freezing quarterly dividend payments that U.S. tech companies were scheduled to transfer back to the United States. The companies affected include Apple, which has $10 billion in payments frozen, Google, which has $8 billion frozen, Microsoft, Amazon, and Meta, which have smaller amounts frozen. The EU is also freezing payments related to U.S. pharmaceutical companies and U.S. defense contractors. The purpose is not permanent confiscation, but rather to hold these funds until, quote, the United States demonstrates willingness to engage in good faith negotiations, end quote. The freeze is legal under EU emergency economic powers, and the $80 billion sitting in frozen accounts creates enormous pressure on U.S. corporations to lobby the White House for de-escalation. Component 3, redirected government contract spending totaling $50 billion. EU member states collectively spend approximately $150 billion per year on government contracts for everything from technology systems to infrastructure to defense equipment. Under the package, EU members are committing to redirect $50 billion of that spending away from U.S. companies and toward European or Asian alternatives. This means that contracts that were previously awarded to American firms will be terminated or not renewed, and will be rebid with preferences for non-U.S. companies. The EU is specifically targeting U.S. defense contractors, Microsoft and Amazon cloud computing contracts, and U.S. construction firms. The goal is to demonstrate that Europe has alternatives to American suppliers, and that U.S. companies will lose access to the European market if the U.S. government continues threatening European economies. Component 4, emergency acceleration of European strategic autonomy, totaling $30 billion. This is the component that terrifies the Pentagon. The EU is committing $30 billion to immediately accelerate programs that reduce European dependence on the United States for defense technology, intelligence, infrastructure, and critical supply chains. The spending includes $10 billion for European fighter aircraft programs. Europe will purchase additional Eurofighter Typhoons and Rafale jets instead of U.S. F-35 fighters, $8 billion for European missile defense systems instead of U.S. Patriot or THAAD systems, $5 billion for European satellite and intelligence infrastructure that reduces reliance on U.S.